What's up, everybody? Today I am having a special privilege to host legendary Rebecca Wirfs-Brock. As you know, Rebecca Wirfs-Brock is a renowned software engineer and consultant who introduced the concept of responsibility-driven development. She is the author of influential books such Designing Object-Oriented Software and Object Design, Roles, Responsibilities, and Collaborations. Her work focuses on improving software design through clean definitions of object responsibilities and collaborations. Rebecca has made significant contributions to the field of software architecture, object oriented programming, and design heuristics. She continues to share her expertise through consulting, writing, and speaking at conferences. So, thank you very much, Ms. Wirfs-Brock, to participate in our podcast. I'm really happy to host you today, and I'm 100% sure that we'll have a really cool discussion about responsibility driven design, domain driven design, and design heuristics. So, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Great. Let's get started.
Cool.
I'm going to show you before we do this. This is my mug a friend gave me. It says Responsibility Champion.
Definitely.
He gave it to me as a Christmas present long ago, and it's really
exactly.
And it says I'm going to say this. You can read it. It says I get whatever shit done. Okay. Anyway, with that.
Great. Yeah, cool. Thank you. So let's get started. As you might guess, I will start from responsibility-driven design. So first things first, could you please share the origins of responsibility-driven design and what inspired you to develop this approach?
Sure. So back in the ancient days, when object technology was first coming out and being commercialized, I worked at Tektronix, and Tektronix was the first commercial developer of the Smalltalk programming language on what they called an AI workstation, right? And I, at the time that the engineering work was started, was working on another project. But when they decided to, go make this AI machine, I had to join. So I went and became a principal engineer, and then a manager of the group that did that software. Now, one of the things is that for a couple of years, people had been doing object-oriented programming in Tektronix Laboratories, the applied research group. And when I encountered Smalltalk and that environment, which is like the richest IDE you've ever seen, as far as playing around, I was just overwhelmed because I'd been writing in assembly language and developing embedded software, and Smalltalk was so foreign, right? It was so strange. So I came with a really I'm really interested in doing this because it seems really, really cool. But how much can I bring that I know already about good engineering, because I've been a good engineer for a dozen years, to this? And I found out that I could bring a lot of my kind of how do I build something? How do I test it? How do I make it be quality? But thinking in terms of objects and how they interact was just, that's not how we do modular programming, right?
Okay.
So I spent time with a lot of really good Smalltalk experts. They'd been programming for 2 years and I hadn't been, right? So they were 2 years ahead of me in that curve. Okay. And I observed that the way that they do thinking about objects and crafting applications resulted in fundamentally different kinds of ways of building a system than people who are using object technology, let's say, in other fashion, like from the C++ world or whatever. And so I was inspired to write a paper And I did it at,
Okay.
at the OOPSLA conference about the differences between if I model thinking in terms of responsibilities instead of just a data driven approach. Objects have data as well as behavior. I come up with fundamentally different and I think better designs.
Yeah.
So that kind of started it, and then I realized that explaining good object design to myself while I started building systems and doing things, other projects, color, small talk, whatever, that I kind of got good at explaining it. So I said, well, I think the world needs to know this too. So that's how the book that you showed came to be. Because at that time, there weren't even any, notation for objects. Booch had the clouds, right? The,
Mhm.
the picture on the front of the book, if you might want to show that, book again, put that up. Uh, my brother drew this kind of like, what are these objects talking to? We didn't have any notation or way of thinking about it.
Uh,
So that's kind of how it came to be, because I thought, wow, this is profound.
mm, that's great. That's great. So, um, after working on responsibility-driven design, what do you think about it? What was your main influence to object-oriented programming, starting from responsibility-driven design?
Well, so yeah, it's. I think that I was used to dealing with bits and bytes and low-level programming, and
Mm-hmm.
when I started thinking in terms of objects in that environment, I had to pop up a level, right? I had to take a bigger view, like what is this class that
Mm-hmm.
defines an object? And so coming up with these concepts that helped me think about how do I build something, the idea of a responsibility, what's that? It's not the same as a method. It's the major activities that an object or a component or a subsystem of objects working together carries out, right? They're general statements about the behaviors that you have put into your design for that particular thing. I'm not going to say entity because that will confuse us when we get to talking about DDD, domain driven
Yeah.
design, for knowing, doing, and deciding, right? So
Mhm.
responsibilities are these general statements that you can think about, stated at a high level, and they can be divided because we do want to keep things into public ones that are exposed and visible and accessible. So I can invoke some other object's responsibilities, and the private ones that get the work done that aren't intended to be shared. So that's kind of the idea of responsibilities, is this
Mhm.
higher level view. And then thinking about collaborations, well, you might just say, oh, it's just sending messages or doing procedure calls, but collaboration is really a usage pattern. So like Bertrand Meyer talked about contracts. Well, we had the
Yeah.
idea of contracts as well. What
Mm.
responsibilities am I using of another object? And then, thinking about the role that objects play and serves within a larger network of objects, and then grouping objects together, like we have subsystems. We'll talk about domains later, but yeah,
Yeah,
those are
definitely.
kind of the main ideas for that.
No, that's great. So, um, the next question is, but what was the main reason of not being the responsibility driven design to be popular? Why it is not popular? Why people not making it popular, let's say? What do you think about it? For example, nowadays, if there is some small library, people actively starting to use it. If there is a small idea, people starting to write a lot of articles about it. But why responsibility driven development is not popular?
Well, so I think it's kind of like um, the fact that it's sort of ingrained into thinking about how do you it became just like patterns. You use a pattern, you know it. So I'm going to say people in the domain-driven design community certainly think about responsibilities of things. It's just not that that's the only tool in their toolkit, if you will. Now, I think a lot of people that are just developing libraries haven't thought about, or they haven't thought a lot about patterns, if you will,
Mhm.
or about how do various pieces of their software work together. But if, I think anyone can look at a system and start drilling down into what are the responsibilities of various elements of it and how do they interact. So I think it's a natural way to think about things, but it's
Mhm.
just, uh, you know, if I'm focusing at the coding level, I'm thinking about what is the API to this particular procedure or function or method, and so I don't back up and take what's this larger chunk and start
Ah,
drilling in that way.
got it. So you say that the responsibility-driven design lives in the core of the, for example, domain-driven design, but people not actually calling it responsibility-driven design. Yeah,
I
something.
would say so. I know that a number of my, people that I interact with in the domain-driven design community have started talking more about responsibilities because they
Um,
realize that the, I'm going to say, the strategic ways of thinking about boundaries
yeah.
of systems, thinking about, well, what are the responsibilities of this domain and how so they can talk about it even at that high level, but they can also talk about it in terms of the elements that they're actually designing too. So
Oh.
they're talking about it. It's not the only thing they're driven by.
Exactly. So I think that was the main reason to participate in DDD communities. The question is, why domain-driven design community? There are a lot of different communities. Why you exactly selected to participate in domain-driven design community?
So I actually participate in a couple of communities, the Agile community and the architecture community, as well as the patterns community. And why I participated in the and do participate in the domain driven design community is because they're the ones who are most, I'm going to say, aggressively thinking about creating models,
Hmm.
not just the code. They're doing both, and they're doing
Ah,
both at the same time. And so a model, when you think about what are the elements of the model, how they interact, responsibilities, I found a natural home there for talking about that and good heuristics for doing things. And so it's a community that cares about good models. And I think responsibility driven design,
um,
definitely does as well. So
fits. Yeah, that's great. That's great. So let's continue talking about responsibility-driven design. So um, could you please explain the idea of responsibility driven design? What is actually responsibility driven design?
well, it's a way of it's a way of creating and evolving a system of an application where I am starting at a behavior of what it should do and how the various elements interact as the first order of business, if you will. The first thing about design, it's a process that says, I need to identify key concepts in the domain, if you're domain driven design, but key concepts in whatever model I'm building, if you're not a DDDer. And I need to understand what their purpose are, and the representation needs to be in the software system I'm building. So, understanding the various roles that various elements in your design play and how they interact is really, really core to that. And then I would say another kind of uh, sort of major way of thinking about design in this is that the reasons why you think at this level first and then dive in is that
Mhm.
you want to keep things that should be private or hidden from the rest of the workings of something should be not revealed
Mhm.
to the outside, whatever the
Absolutely.
outside is.
Encapsulating something, yeah.
Yeah, encapsulation is the putting them together. Information hiding is revealing only what needs to be revealed.
Hmm.
And that allows you to have this sort of flexibility. And again, design flexibility is another kind of hallmark of responsibility driven design. if I need to build in flexibility, how do I do it in a way that allows to do extensions without, mucking around with too much stuff. So building in flexibility was another kind of, why not let me change my mind? So for example, in the various programming languages, um, you know, they have different styles, various object-oriented programming languages for uh, what is public and private,
Access
between various
modifiers.
elements. Yeah, and you go into C sharp, and that's different from Java, and that's different from Python objects, and you kind of have to learn. Well, okay, here's the defaults that those languages have. Now, what's a good way to package things so that they can be extended? So I can use that public and private responsibilities and extension ideas. So,
Oh, that's great. So at the end, responsibility-driven design will help us to write extensible, reusable modules, applications. Yeah.
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, there's nothing, I'm going to say, there's nothing old-fashioned about those kind of design goals.
Exactly.
Now, do I create elaborate diagrams to show this? Probably not these days. But
Got it. So how do you identify and assign responsibilities to objects? For example, when I start to work on my application, I have business requirements. I've started to work on that. So how can I identify and assign responsibilities to my objects? Should I get a clear definition of the business rules? I don't know from where it starts and from where should I continue to
yeah, well, so
identify it?
it's interesting. So what you're really doing when you're thinking about finding responsibilities is essentially taking the work of the application, which have to enforce the business rules that you get, however you get them, and trying to do it in a way that is coherent and well designed and easily tested and all that kind of stuff. So one of the things that I think is important is to understand the various kinds of objects, if you're using object technology, that you might use. And that's the idea of role stereotypes. So, for example, if I have a business object, business aggregate, if I have a service, what should they do? And there are a number of stereotypes that were part of what we saw in many applications. So I just, invented the idea of role stereotypes to help figure it out. So there's controllers, there are objects that are responsible for structuring other objects. Just think of a hash table as really a structure that has some behavior, but there are other things that we may have. Think about a repository in the domain-driven design. That's also structuring information that you can retrieve. There are information holders. There are objects that are tasked with providing an interface where they're receiving requests in one format and transforming it into others. So there are all kinds of stereotypes to think about. So when you're first starting with responsibilities, usually the best way to do it is to run through a bunch of scenarios that your business and see how where is the boundary of the business service that's handling it? How is it delegating to other objects? What are the business concepts that need to be there? And develop a model of that. I mean, so I don't do it just one object at a time. I'm dealing with a set of objects, thinking about it. Yeah.
Got it. So, should we use responsibility-driven design in all sorts of applications? Or you have some sort of requirements, for example, if you have like a domain-driven design dashboard, for example, if you have complex business, okay, use domain-driven design. If you have 10, 15 user stories, you can, if you're developing CRUD applications, you don't need to apply domain-driven design. Does responsibility-driven design also have this sort of requirements?
Oh, to say, when is it worthwhile? And I would say if I'm doing a very simple scripting, like put something there, do something, I don't really care how you do it. And does the action of like partitioning things into this, here's the controller, here's some coordination that it does with other services, whatever. Don't need it at all, right? However you do it, go for it. But a lot of applications, even I'm going to say even simple CRUD-like applications have behavior, right? So when I get something from a web page, right? So if I get a lot of information, I need to probably validate that it's okay. So it probably hits a service. It might delegate to objects that check rules, So even there, if it's more beyond just simple CRUD, and you want to do it in a way that so I can start breaking it up into objects that interact or functions that interact. I've worked with people that have taken responsibilities and do that to think about functional programming design too.
Even functional programming.
Why not? What do functions do, right?
Yeah, definitely this behavior. Yeah, sounds
Their
really interesting.
behavior. So.
Got it. So, about responsibility-driven design. So you say that if we have some sort of responsibilities behavior, we should use responsibility-driven design. In modern software development, especially with agile methodologies, how can developers effectively apply responsibility-driven design?
So it's not as if I have this very heavy-handed way of creating a design first before I code. Never was that way in Smalltalk. Doesn't need to be that way in Agile development. In some sense, Scott Ambler, I'll say him. He says, "Well, you should do a little bit of modeling before you implement every story, right?" and so I'm saying, well, yeah, okay. I can have a discussion at the whiteboard or whatever, saying, well, how this might work. Okay, let's go work on it. So it's not like it has to be done in one big, giant modeling effort. It can be just-in-time modeling if you're in an Agile team. But if you want to preserve, have a consistent design, if you're creating objects that represent or that represent business concepts, you need to clarify them. You need to make them, you're going to reuse those in perhaps multiple scenarios. So you do need to spend time making sure that those concepts and behaviors are consistent, rather than just, here's another scenario, let's just sling together another set of objects. You do want to get some reuse out of that. So.
Okay, got it. So
Agile can be just in time, but it also needs periods of consolidating if you want to have a consistent model across behaviors.
I got it. How about the artifacts of responsibility-driven design? For example, in domain-driven design, at the end, we are having domain models that describe the business, the valuable domain models, not anemic models, rich domain models. But what we are getting at the end of responsibility-driven design, artifacts.
So it depends on your amount of formalism that you want to have.
Okay.
I have seen people take and at the end of design process produce documents, and I guess I'd say they're less formal than what you might think, where they define what are the major responsibilities of various subdomains. For example, at that highest level, what are the major responsibilities?
Okay.
So that's like, I can take and throw into the domain-driven design world, the idea of elaborating what the major responsibilities. I can also, if I'm using object technology, talk about the key concepts in a particular domain and show what those responsibilities are. And if I want to get really precise, I suppose I could use UML, but I could just list the responsibilities and the purpose and show relationships between these objects. Here's the control, here's the service, whatever. So I've known people that use a tool like Structurizer or whatever, and they tend to create documents where they show what the major responsibilities are too. If I'm having something that's designed to be extended, and I'm not just a framework developer, but I'm someone who tried to build a consistent way of doing rules, let's say, or validation and verification of information. I might create, sets of things where they're designed to be extended, or how do I plug in another? And so I might write a recipe that shows here's where the extensible responsibilities are. So there's lots of different potential artifacts that you can have. I've actually even, talking about, the output of design, sometimes people use responsibilities to look at legacy systems and understand what the heck they are. So I worked with a client that it was for an energy company in the UK.
Okay.
And they had like 300 applications, metering, all kinds of things, resource allocate, whatever. It wasn't just IT. And essentially what they did is they spent time and they figured out that they could create these little mini documents of the responsibilities of these systems. And then, a little bit about their history. And then it was really, other people could work on these, and it was, it was like, it was almost like reverse archaeology at that high level, not the deepest level that got people traction into working on them. So yeah, you can use it at, various different, angles. It's not always to create a design. It can also be used to look at an existing system and saying, well, what's it doing? What's its control style? What's its patterns of collaboration? What are the major responsibilities of this domain? Anyway, so.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah. So the last question about responsibility-driven design is, as you know, I have several times asked this question to other guests. I want to hear your answer for this question.
Okay.
Software developers, especially like the exact description of, let's say, user story, they don't want to dive into details of business. So I have a small task, give it to me, and I will work on that. Because most of the developers don't like struggling, discussing things with business analytics. So in most cases, we're just coders, okay? So
Just
give
let
me
me
a task.
code. Just let me code.
Yeah,
Yes.
let me code. Yeah, definitely. So
Okay.
how much should we know about business? Or do you think that we should be also a domain expert to dive into details of responsibility-driven design, to apply responsibility-driven design?
I think that you have to be interested in the structure of your application or your service or whatever. And you have to be, at least if you're wanting to have concepts that represent concepts in the domain, you have to know a little bit about the domain. Yeah. But if I'm supposed to implement the next story, hopefully someone who cares about the domain has been part of your team, and then you need to know how to add that behavior to your system without breaking things. So you do need to know a little bit about, but if we have good, I'm going to say practices around testing, which, testing has always been part of
Software development
domain
lifecycle.
development, domain modeling, responsibility. You have to test the heck out of anything. If those tests keep working with your, I'm going to say, adding capabilities that goes a long way there. But if you have no interest in exploring design options, then just go hack. But
No.
whatever you'll create is what you're doing. But if I want to have discussions and become more senior about, well, what style should we use here? What is this framework that we're going to use going to do to the way that we interact? You need to think a little bit more beyond the great details of the code.
Got it.
I get lost in details. I love details.
Yeah, me too.
I have
Me
to
too.
pop back up
Yeah, me too.
from time to time. Yeah.
So, regarding to responsibility during design, let's switch to the exact object-oriented stuff. Nowadays, people actually, let's say, most of the new developers don't know the object-oriented programming. When you ask object-oriented programming, they think that, okay, encapsulation, abstraction, inheritance, polymorphism, that's it. Yeah, okay. So they are checking what is encapsulation, what is inheritance, and what is polymorphism, and voila. This is the object-oriented programming. This is the exact 1,000 lines, 1,000 pages of Bertram Meyer in 3 terms. That's really funny. Right. Yeah. So, do you still think that this book is applicable to read? Designing
Yeah,
object-oriented software.
yeah, I do. I would recommend the newer book, which you can get free and download. But
Definitely, I
I
will
also,
share the link.
yeah, you will share that, yeah. But probably people don't want to take and practice all this stuff in deep rigor. They just want to think about, how can I start? What are good responsibilities? What when I'm first starting, it's like, if I'm programming in Python, why do I need objects, right? Because you can actually program in many of these languages without, with one big DTO, right? For example, I'm just saying, you don't need to break things down. And you go, well, is it a lot of work to create these different classes of objects and do this? And it's like, yeah, the first few times it's very, you don't see the benefit until you can build on what you're doing. So, if all I'm doing is writing tiny little programs and shipping a lot of tiny little, services, you don't see the benefit. But if you want to try to build complex systems that can evolve over time, yeah, you kind of need to get into it. But you can
Definitely.
get there. Start by looking at a system that does have that you're working on, and see what the responsibilities are and what the control style is, what the patterns of collaboration are. Try to just kind of understand that.
Yeah, definitely.
When you
No
put
way
stuff
without responsibilities. Yeah, exactly. Now let's do a smooth moving forward to domain-driven design.
Okay.
Yeah, my first question is related to the relation between responsibility-driven design and domain-driven design. So, how do you see responsibility-driven design aligns and completes domain-driven design?
So when Eric Evans was writing his book, I was one of the reviewers of his book.
Oh,
So
great.
just so that you
Great to
know,
know.
I'm a longtime friend and colleague of Eric. And Eric also ran his book through a number of different patterns conferences. I wasn't involved in patterns then, but anyway, where it was reviewed by people that were very much into the patterns community. So just to give you sort of a background of that, when I reviewed Eric's book, I kind of pointed out, because he was aware of what I had been doing, connections to him. And if you read his book, you will find that there are some connections in there. So to me, they're really complementary. I think that later, people in the more recently have said, well, there's really these tactical patterns that pretty much are focused on object technology. And then there are these strategic patterns for structuring and preserving boundaries and understanding relationships between chunks of functionality in a massive system. And so the point is, I can apply responsibility-driven design thinking to the designing of any, if I use the tactical design patterns, for sure. That they
Yeah.
go hand in hand. There's no problem. There's no friction there whatsoever.
Mhm.
How do I find the responsibilities of a service, or how do I
Entities,
find,
value objects,
yeah,
aggregate, all of
how do
them.
I understand how value objects work with other things, right? Or how do I need to have strategies here or whatever? So I think
Mhm.
about sort of like core patterns. Not only did Eric, and he didn't invent those patterns; those patterns
Yeah,
existed
exactly.
before, right? He just put them together in a nice package. What I think the most interesting part, but people don't apply very carefully because it takes kind of a little higher level overview of a system rather than getting down into the bits and bytes, is those strategic patterns when you're talking about boundaries
Bounded
and
context, context mappings, yeah.
all that stuff. That's like, whoa, what's that? Why can't I just implement my functionality here?
Yeah, it is
Uh,
a bit
so, so,
complex, yeah.
but if I look at those and those are valid for understanding, is like when I create a concept, I need to understand, and I represent it as a class or as a function or as a service. What is its scope in my system? So understanding boundaries, even though they
Mhm.
may appear like fuzzy things to you when you first start, is really important, because meaning does change between, if you build big IT systems.
Oh,
So,
that's great. So
yeah.
we can apply responsibility driven design in a strategic and also in a tactical manner for
Yes.
specifying the
Mhm.
bounded context, and especially for the communication you talked about in responsibility driven design. We can apply it for the context map, defining
Mhm.
communication between boundaries, and also the internals of one boundary, like entities, value objects, aggregates, domain services, events, etc. Yeah.
Domain services, events, yeah. An event is just really an information provider, or you generate an event. If
Yeah.
I think about in terms of the responsibility, it's an information provider, and you have to
Oh,
think about, when you're designing that event, what you should reveal outside of boundaries, right? Same
great.
as objects, right? So
Definitely.
an event is a thing, right? When I generate event records, I need to be very careful about how much dependency I'm, uh, well, hidden results that I don't want to reveal in an event. So event design is, same kind of principles that you apply. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Just-
Exactly. Definitely. So, when applying domain driven design, what type of problems we face when we start to apply DDD for the first time? Long story short, in your experience, what are the challenges of applying domain-driven design in a real-world projects?
Okay. So when I go to teams, or when I work with teams and I introduce a new way of thinking about things, the first thing they have to do is like care,
Yeah.
right? What does it matter? And when I encounter, and I'm still looking at new kinds of ways of designing things, any new design approach, I need to kind of like make it fit with what I already am doing, right?
Mhm.
So if I'm interested in bringing domain driven design into a group, the first thing is to say, why should you care?
Uh-huh.
And to convince them. And the best way to do it is to say, well, let's try it. Let's see what we have already, because usually there's something already there.
Exactly.
And can this help us? Can it buy us clarity in what we should do? And I think that teams being, new to domain-driven design, I'm thinking back, here's what I do, but what do teams do? They shouldn't easily discard everything that they've done. They've built systems before. Um, and and they still kind of probably built systems, but they may have had some problems. So um, I don't think you should feel anxious when someone says, "Hey, try domain modeling." You should say, "Well, what can I learn? And can I adapt? And if I take this big monolithic thing and break it down, is it worth it? If it is, because it's likely to change, maybe I'll try this as an experiment." You don't have to throw out everything you know, but you have to be happy enough to try new stuff with an open mind. And that's, it's like, so if you're on a project where people aren't giving you the space to experiment, it's really difficult to do that. If you're
Definitely.
under extreme pressure, oh, you must use domain-driven design because it's going to save our product. Boy, that's not. You need to have some. On the other hand, I understand the pressures and Agile sometimes, and I'm going to say this, has made it so that it can be easier to make more pressure of just getting anything out rather than anything that has lasting quality. So this modeling stuff takes time. You need to experiment,
Exactly.
you need to play around.
But for me, the hardest side of domain-driven design is strategic rather than tactical, because developers really love tactical stuff like applying patterns, entities, value objects, aggregates. They are all in coding stuff, like in detailed design. But we need high-level design, strategic design first, and it takes a lot of collaboration, a lot of time, discussion, involving business analytics, domain experts. So,
Yeah, that stuff takes experimentation. It isn't just that you're going to solve it by. You're going to say, well, what is our boundaries here? What are the value of them? What are the relationships to various things? And I can say even architects don't think that way, haven't thought that way. So it is what are the certainly we know about dependencies and managing complex deployments and all that
yeah,
sort of stuff. But what are the real relationships, and how does it make sense to evolve various pieces of our systems? That's
great.
the hard part.
Yeah, that's hard. So, then what's your approach? Let's say in a problem space, we have subdomains. Yeah? In a solution space, we have bounded context. And we always strive to have, in an ideal manner, to have one-to-one relationship between subdomains and bounded contexts. So why it is not possible to have one-to-one relationship between them when designing all this stuff?
Well, so it's interesting, and if you spend time with Eric Evans, or people that are more comfortable with, I'm going to say, the fluidity of bounded context, that they're not just your file structure and your module structure and everything that I laid out first, but that they can be small, they can change over time. You realize that you have to start thinking differently than the file system of which your Git repositories are, right? And then you realize that in order to do that, you have to kind of let go of the idea that, well, if I were starting from a green field, and no one ever does, I could draw these boundaries and put the modules in there, put the structures in there, but behaviors and ideas, concepts, business things change over time, right? So why do we think that these boundaries are going to stick with our module? It'd be nice if they could, but we don't have time to refactor everything all the time. But we do need to understand what the boundaries of meaning are, which is really important. So, yeah, it's hard. I think that once you identify a domain, thinking that it's never going to change is kind of like wishful thinking. Just like, oh, I can predict how long it's going to take to write this bit of new code that I've never written before. So they are not the same as modular boundaries. They may start out that way. And if you look at a legacy system and you start talking to domain experts about it, you realize that meaning can be muddied. That it's sort of like sometimes there's like, oh, this is what an order meant here. Okay, this is what it means here. Well, it's slightly different. Is that a different context? Well, no, it's kind of shifting. And now we think about it as a purchase order. So, I mean, it's not all as clear as you'd like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's great. So, do you think that domain-driven design with combination of responsibility-driven design is a silver bullet?
Oh, there are no silver bullets.
Definitely.
And there are no werewolves either. I think that I'm not promising a silver bullet. Any sort of enthusiast, will oversell the utility of any sort of way of thinking. But I think it's a silver handshake, because it allows you to think and talk and communicate with both developers and with business folks, and that's kind of rare. So,
okay, great.
No silver bullets.
Exactly. Regarding to the domain-driven design and responsibility-driven design, how do you approach between domain experts and developers to achieve a shared understanding of the domain? We have team of developers, we have business analytics. How we can organize, I don't know, the collaboration or etc. What's your, let's say, plans to merge them together to have common understanding about the business domain?
So there are lots of ways to collaborate. One of the popular ways is event storming activities, right, where people can get together and they go through, Alberto Brandolini's and other folks' way of popular activity for domain experts to reach a common understanding at a point in time. That's really what it is, a snapshot of a common understanding. But there's lots of other ways to share domain knowledge in a way that gets people to kind of get to know each other rather than just working on a problem together. And I've done this a lot. And I know some of my other fellow DDDers do this. I like talking to domain experts one-on-one, right? Talking to them can be really extremely productive. If I'm going over there and saying, well, I've got a bunch of functionality we need to add, can we talk about this? Can we just talk about it? Also, I don't know, depends on how teams are structured, but ensemble programming or mob programming, as it's AKA known as that, where I actually get someone who is in the domain and we just sit down and build things together, can be really great. But, not everybody has that time, right? They can't devote, I'm going to say domain expertise is really scarce. And one thing you find out is that domain experts don't always agree with each other.
So, exactly. This is another big problem. Definitely.
It is. So I ask people to tell me stories, and asking them what's the most important thing to know after they've rambled on for a long time, can be very useful. And then if they're actually not just an analyst, but a domain expert doing their job. And I don't think analysts are the same as domain experts. They are translators for us historically,
Exactly.
and there still are analysts around. Anyway, just observing what they do, right, versus what they say they do. That's another interesting kind of shadowing them around, because they don't always, they're telling you a story that they want you to hear, but things are maybe more complex. So they kind of simplified
Slightly
it for you
different.
because you're a developer, right? But you go, oh man. And then as a, crunching knowledge, someone who is responsible for that, which I think, senior developers should be, isn't to pick one view over another, but to kind of reconcile them. So oftentimes I've come up to domain experts after I've kind of wandered around and done this, and we've implemented some functionality. And I say, well, you said this, but this other person said this. What's going on here? I need to understand, because I got to do something. And it's interesting because that's anyway. And it would be really nice if I could get the people who disagree to agree, but they're not really going to.
Exactly.
So yeah, there's a lot of ways of getting getting domain expertise, and a lot of them is kind of meeting. I think the bottom line is you're meeting them on a playing field where they feel comfortable, just sharing with you, and you just listen. Maybe behind closed doors sometimes, because they might be frustrated.
That's cool. That's cool. So, okay. Thank you very much for answering the domain-driven design questions also. So the last session, I want to talk about design heuristics. I know that you're actively working on design heuristics, and I would like to start from the definition. What exactly design heuristics is?
Well, so basically, where I didn't invent this term, but I got it from a guy who wrote about heuristics. His name is Billy Von Cohn, and in his book, an engineer's approach to design, the method for, he talks about three different types of heuristics.
Okay.
And for design. And one are what your values are, what are your guiding heuristics, or maybe, for example, your principles. And then what do you do to solve something, right? So they're like action-oriented heuristics. So I got interested in this because a friend of mine, Eric Simmons, he's worth mentioning because he throws me ideas and says, "Well, Rebecca, what are you going to do with them?" A few years later, I'm still working through the stack of stuff that I'm doing about heuristics. Anyway, he said, "Well, it's interesting because I'm not a pattern guy. I mean, he used to work for Construct Software and for Intel, so he's like a pretty solid engineer. I'm not a patterns person, but why do people do patterns, and why do they have trouble with patterns, and why do they have trouble with design agreement and all that? And it really comes down to, what are your heuristics that you've learned over time, and how do you adjust them when you're in a new context, right? So when I go to, as you may know, anytime I'm implementing a pattern, I don't just take it off the shelf and plunk it in. I really don't. I have to adapt it to my current situation. And the same goes for any sort of design approach that you have. You're adapting it on the fly to what you're doing. And you're doing it based on your values, which may shift when the context shifts. If I'm hacking something out and it's due tomorrow, I'm not going to do the same level of testing seriously that I might normally do, right? So when I think about design approaches, I want to understand what the context is forcing me to, to consider or not consider as important values, how they might shift when the context shifts, what my guiding design principles are, and those can change too based on the kind of application I'm doing. And then what do I do? What are my actions? And it's all a matter of time, energy, and so our heuristics are what we do when we apply any particular pattern, but they're also what we do when we design anything. So
No, that's great. That's great. So the next question is, how can design heuristics guide developers when they are faced with architectural dilemmas?
So it'd be very interesting. Let's say, is this a decision that I can make on my own, or do I have to discuss it with other people? That's the first kind of question. Because we have to understand our underlying design values that are driving us at the moment. And I think oftentimes people get into heated disagreements because they haven't found that common value ground, right? So that's actually kind of interesting is, why am I yelling at you and you don't understand, right? Okay, what am I valuing now? What approach should I take? What's guiding me? What are the things I'm really thinking about right now? And that leads me to certain actions. And so when we're making decisions as a group, which is, if I'm making them with myself, I don't have this same kind of discussion. If I'm making them with a group, well, maybe I do. The next day I look at my code and say, did I really think that? Anyway, but when I'm with a group, it's kind of good to lay out to kind of step back from the heat of the moment, facing a dilemma, and says, well, what should we do now in this context? And what values are we going to support? And maybe the value is, I need to get it done, right? Maybe I'm compromising on my what I really like to do, but we got to do this. So we need to have those kinds of discussions. And I think it's okay to recognize that your design values will change based on the context. You said a dilemma, right? And that people won't agree. Have you ever worked with someone you don't agree with? It's like, how do you get them to, it's like, they just don't get it. And it's like, okay, what don't I get about them? You got to kind of, what maybe I could convince them if I understood what their values are and say, well, I value this. Do you? You might need to find some common ground before you can make a decision.
This is a bit complex. Yeah, exactly. So
this is people skills,
Yeah, exactly.
Having a conversation with someone. Yeah.
The complex one in a software is actually a person, a group of people.
Yeah, it's like I don't know. Have you ever had anyone, for example, you're writing your code, you checked it in, your tests are there, and then they rewrite your code in a style that they like better? It's like, oh, I don't like if then else's. I want to have the question mark anyway. Yeah. So it's like, okay, at some point, when your values just aren't quite lined up, you say, what's it worth it to me to push on this rather than not? If consistency is the goal and this person just feels compelled to go through everybody's code and do that, what's the harm? But it's like, you got to kind of fight your battles there.
Yeah, the balance. Exactly. So what are your favorite, most impactful design heuristics?
Well, I think that in some sense, they're kind of broadly, I'm going to say, they are very situational, right? So when I am doing testing, let's say, for example, I have to think about why am I doing testing and at what level? And so my heuristics for developing testing code or tests have to be based on what we're trying to achieve with testing. And if it's, so they're very situational. So I'm not going to say, what's my favorite heuristic?
Depending,
say,
it depends.
What heuristic am I going to do right now? Of course, responsibility-driven thinking, heuristics, and values are very important to me, but they're also ones that have to do with time or complexity. Some heuristics are that I really like are if something seems too simple, it probably is,
Ah,
right? So I don't. It's not like I like to introduce complexity, but just banging something out, it's probably too simple. So I like to look
mm,
for things that will make this work under the right conditions.
mm.
I mean, I started out my life as an evaluation engineer, so I like
Oh,
to make sure things work. So maybe that's probably one of my, let's understand under what conditions this is going to work.
oh, that's great. So, how design heuristics helps us to manage complexity in
Um,
software development?
well, so again, you have to understand the context. You have to understand the values, and you have to understand the scope of any sort of decision you're making. And so I think understanding understanding the constraints that you really are under rather than those that you think you might is very important, right?
Okay.
Sometimes developers think, oh, I have to get this done tomorrow. Well, no, somebody wanted it done by tomorrow. What does it mean? So you have to kind of push back on things or assumptions, right, to get to what's really needed. And that takes a bit of being, I won't say cranky, but somewhat questioning
Mm.
about things. Not cranky, yeah. Not just saying no because, but asking why. Um, Oftentimes, you find a lot of what's being asked of a development team isn't really a requirement; it's just something that thinks it's a requirement. I mean, I hate to say that, but
Yeah, exactly. So,
it's true.
um, I think regarding to design heuristics, that should be okay. And
Okay.
um, I want to ask some general questions. And one of them is looking back at your career, what would you say has been the most significant shift in the way software is designed today compared to when you started?
So when I started back in the last century,
Hmm.
uh, we oftentimes built things from the ground up. I mean, I was in an engineering organization and we built the operating system and then we built this and then we built that on top of it. We did compilers. We built things from the ground up. We just made things work. And we made them work in a small amount of memory. I was working on embedded
Hmm.
systems. Okay. So these days, I'm going to say nobody starts from a green field, right?
Definitely.
We have to, and that's, we have to pick what we're going to do, pick amongst the 50 different packages we might use,
Wow.
whatever. We
Tons
have to
of
go,
abstractions.
yeah, we have to, um, and that's a big shift. And I would say another kind of so software isn't just like build it from the ground up anymore. So you have to understand the ecosystem that you're in,
Hmm.
and you have to understand when it's not the right ecosystem for what you're trying to build if you're trying to innovate too. I mean, sometimes we get locked into things. So that's a we don't design in a vacuum, or we don't get to design everything, and that's
Is
probably a
it
big.
good or bad?
Is it good or bad?
Yeah,
It just is,
it
right?
is what it is.
If I can carve out, and this is actually, I am not a fan of saying no frameworks, but how much burden, for example, does React programming bring to web development? That's using that just as an
Yeah, yeah,
example.
yeah,
Do
yeah.
we do we pick, something that has all of these rich features and try to figure them out, or do we try to carve something out so that we can focus on the problem rather than learning the technology? And
Mm, yeah.
for me, that balance is like get the job done, right? That's where I'm shifting,
Exactly.
towards.
So regarding to object-oriented programming, again, what went wrong? So you are also a member of Golden Age. You guys did a lot of cool object-oriented stuff. You all moved like Bertram Meyer, Grad de Bush, Ken Peck. You moved object-oriented forward. But now we have I don't think that we have the good object-oriented programming. So what went wrong with object-oriented programming? Why the languages we are using, we are saying that they are object-oriented, they are not actually object-oriented.
So it's interesting. I actually think objects are very successful. And the amount of people still doing, I'm going to say, you're probably going to fall out of your chair when I say the people doing Java programming, it's amazing number of people still programming in Java. I had to make that shift from Smalltalk to, non-live languages in around 2000. My last Smalltalk client was in 2000. So like for 20 some years, been doing other stuff. And what happened was it wasn't cool, and it wasn't cool anymore, right? So JavaScript came out. People are programming, in many different languages. It wasn't
like F#.
Yeah, exactly. And there always is the tendency to say, if we're going to something new, the other thing has to be bad, right? There's a reason why we're going to the new thing. So, I don't think, and I'm going to challenge the idea that they failed. It's just like it's found its place. It's not the cool kid on the block. So, and I would also say that there was some misimpressions in the very early days of objects that people kind of still think of as like, oh, you're not modeling the real world. We were fighting that back then. You're modeling what your system needs to do. And those, if you think, well, real world models, that's baloney, right? It's all too abstract and too theoretical. No, we're just trying to build something that is flexible and extensible. It's like, okay, now I can do, a long lament about why live programming environments aren't there. And I think that once you start getting into like Python notebooks and things where you can actually explore, you get a sense of what that kind of was back then when we were, had an immersive environment for programming. Maybe it's failed because everyone likes command line programming. I don't know.
I'm not a big fan of it. I really don't like it.
I like IDEs, but I have worked with clients, for 10 years that are just using 6 Vim windows simultaneously. So anyway, I'm just saying, I think kind of where you hit the curve of new technologies sort of, kind of determine what you think is the cool thing to do.
How about the AI and programming?
AI and programming. Well, so I know that if you have a small, instead of a gigantic LLM, that a small, programming assistant kind of approach to tweaking something or understanding stuff or explaining stuff can actually do some kind of cool stuff. Do I expect it to take over finding the concepts in the domain in the right way? Probably not. Right. So yeah, I think it's just another tool in our toolkit. I know some people think it's going to take programming away from us.
Replace us. Will replace us. Do you think that it will replace us?
maybe we'll take away, the boring stuff that we have to do. That would be fine. So we can focus on the cool stuff.
Definitely. But it will not take over us, yeah?
I don't think so. If we're coming up with, it's interesting. It's this parallel to long ago. People said, "Well, why don't you just define an account class or a customer class, and everybody can use it, right?" And it's like, no, everybody is unique, right? What they view of a customer or an account is different based on the business or whatever. But they really wanted to have unified models. And if you think about LLMs as coming up with the main concepts that we can all use, it's only going to do the least common average. It's not going to do what your business needs to do. So, yeah.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear.
Well, I hope for good modelers, still to be, and if they can write code or tell us what libraries to use and tweak our code a little bit, or even critique our tests, that's good.
Yeah, but they are still propagating AI and saying that it will replace developers and you will not get jobs in the next 5-10 years as a software engineer. So yeah.
We'll see.
Well, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay. So how about, as someone who has influenced so many developers, what do you think the next generation of software architects should focus on learning?
Anything they can. I actually think if I'm learning about design and architecture, that I ought to be exposed to as many things as I can, and that means even AI. But I'm also thinking that getting exposed to implications, if I'm an architect, about socio-technical systems, not just the technology, but that stuff around people. Let's not forget that aspect of it, because and that kind of says, well, and it's not human factors, but it's sort of HCI like, to realize that when I'm building something, a complex system for lots of people to use, that I need to understand how they perceive and interact with my system more. And kind of we've sort of forgotten those users. We domain experts maybe we'll talk to them, but those users. So learning more about that is a good thing. I think if you're not user centric, you can just build things based on assumptions, and we shouldn't be.
Okay. The last question, I want to get back to domain-driven design. Some people still think that domain-driven design is just a trend, like a scam. I don't know, like an AI. What do you think about it?
Yeah, well, it's a modeling approach that talks about domain concepts, that talks about subdomains, it talks about packaging up larger conceptual boundaries in systems. Is that trendy? Maybe the focus on the tactical patterns, which you say developers do, is a bit, I'm going to say, trendy or dated. Yeah, overemphasized. And the reason for that is that a lot of that idea about aggregates and boundaries and whatever has to deal with transactional systems, business transactions. But those other concepts like value objects or other services or whatever have nothing to do. Not everything is a transaction-oriented business application.
Definitely, yeah.
Right. So if I'm modeling controllers, like, which I have done work with people on controlling networks, network systems, or drilling, rig control software systems. I can still use the domain concepts, but I don't necessarily think about those transactional boundaries so much. I still use events, but all this other sort of like, is this an aggregate root? Don't worry about that so much as what's the concept here, and
Okay.
what behaviors does it have? Because we're not everything is transactional.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely. We had the data-centric applications, then we moved forward to domain-centric applications, and then what is next?
What is next? I think there's all kinds of next. I think that human-centered applications,
Oh,
things that and I'm hopeful that we have things not just like my watch here, but that we have applications that are really designed not to be Big Brother watching over us, but that are aiding and assisting people in living better lives. So environmental kind of systems, systems that help us regulate the energy we use, support us in the values that we have in the world that we want to, all kinds of things like that. There's cool, innovative kind of applications. I see people talking about sustainability
yeah.
in engineering
Green world
practices.
sustainability.
Yeah, so like let's save the planet. So I worry about the AI LLMs, consuming all the resources, so we don't have the resources to do those kind of software systems. We'll sort it out.
Exactly. Yeah. That's all from my side. It was really, really interesting discussion with you, Miss Wirfs-Brock. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation. I hope in the
Yeah,
future we'll have second discussion, maybe to dive into details of responsibility-driven design, or dive into details of domain-driven design, heuristic design, depending on you. So I hope we will have second
sure.
discussion with you. Yeah. For
I,
now,
I look forward to it, Tural.
thank you very much. For now, that's all from our side. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation again, and thank you very much for answering my questions.
You're welcome.